how does dopamine work and what does it do? Well, first of all, it is not just responsible for pleasure. It is responsible for motivation and drive, primarily at the psychological level. Also for craving. Those three things are sort of the same: motivation, drive, and craving. It also controls time perception. And we will get deep into how dopamine can modulate time perception and how important it is that everybody be able to access increases in dopamine at different time scales. This turns out to be important to not end up addicted to substances, but it also turns out to be very important to sustain effort and be a happy person over long periods of time. Dopamine is also vitally important for movement. I'll explain the neural circuits for dopamine and mindset and dopamine in movement in a moment, but in diseases like Parkinson's or Lewy body's dementia, which is similar to Parkinson's in many ways, there's a depletion or death of dopamine neurons at a particular location in the brain, which leads to shaky movements, challenges in speaking, challenges in particular in initiating movement. And because dopamine is depleted elsewhere, too, people with Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia also experience drops in motivation and affect, meaning mood. They tend to get depressed and so on. When those people are properly treated, they can, not always, but they can recover some fluidity of movement, some ability to initiate movement, and almost without question, those people feel better psychologically, not just because they can move, but also because dopamine impacts mood and motivation. You have two main neural circuits in the brain that dopamine uses in order to exert all its effects. The first one, basically what we call this, is the mesocorticolimbic pathway. This is the pathway by which dopamine influences motivation, drive, and craving. This is the pathway that really gets disrupted in addictions, where in particular drugs that influence the release of dopamine, like cocaine and methamphetamine, we'll talk about those drugs today, they tap into this pathway. But if you are pursuing a partner, a boyfriend or girlfriend, if you're pursuing a degree in school, if you're pursuing a finish line in a race, you are tapping into this so-called mesocorticolimbic pathway. This is the classic reward pathway in all mammals. The other pathway emerges from an area in the brain called the substantia nigra. The first part of a word tells you where the neurons are. And then the second part tells you where they are connecting to. So when I say nigrostriatal pathway, it means that the neurons are in substantia nigra and they connect to the striatum, nigrostriatal pathway. So we got these two pathways, one mainly for movement, right? This is the substantia nigra to dorsal striatum. And we've got this other pathway, the so-called mesocorticolimbic pathway, that's for reward, reinforcement, and motivation. Dopamine is perhaps one of the most powerful molecules that any of us has inside of us, and the one that we ought to all think very carefully about how we leverage. Because while most experiences and most things that we do and take and eat and etc. won't create enormous highs and enormous lows in dopamine, even subtle fluctuations in dopamine really shape our perception of life and what we're capable of and how we feel. Dopamine is the universal currency of foraging and seeking. Right? We sometimes talk about motivation and craving, but what we mean in the evolutionary adaptive context, what we mean is foraging and seeking water, seeking food, seeking mates, seeking things that make us feel good and avoiding things that don't make us feel good, but in particular seeking things that will provide sustenance and pleasure in the short term and will extend the species in the long term. The behavior that most of us are familiar with of engaging in something that we really enjoy, going to a restaurant that we absolutely love, or engaging in some way with some person that we really, really enjoy. But if we continue to engage in that behavior over and over again, it kind of loses its edge. It starts to kind of feel less exciting to us. Some of us experience that drop in excitement more quickly and more severely than others. But everyone experiences that to some extent. And this has direct roots in these evolutionarily conserved circuits. Some of you may be hearing this and think, no, that's not how it works for me. I'm just riding higher and higher all the time. I love my kids. I love my job. I love school. I love wins. I don't want losses. I agree. We all feel good when we are achieving things, but oftentimes we are feeling good because we are layering in different aspects of life, consuming things and doing things that increase our dopamine. We're getting those peaks. But afterward, the drop in baseline occurs, and it always takes a little while to get back to our stable baseline. We really all have a sort of dopamine set point. And if we continue to indulge in the same behaviors or even different behaviors that increase our dopamine in these big peaks over and over and over again, we won't experience the same level of joy from those behaviors or from anything at all. Now, that has a name. It's called addiction. But even for people who aren't addicted, even for people who don't have an attachment to any specific substance or behavior, this drop in below baseline after any peak in dopamine is substantial, and it governs whether or not we are going to feel motivated to continue to pursue other things. When people are pursuing dopamine peaks over and over and over, and they aren't getting them, typically it's because they've been pursuing that activity far too often. The cycling back and forth between dopamine and low dopamine states, dopamine fasting as it were, but maybe just low dopamine states, these are natural rhythms that exist in the nervous system. We have to remember what the dopaminergic system is there for. I'll say it again, I wasn't consulted at the design phase, but we know as a generic form of motivation and pursuit, you can imagine the human or the animal that's hungry or thirsty. It needs energy to go pursue the thing. So the idea that you have to eat in order to get energy, that's true. But you need energy in order to get the thing to eat. So our nervous system has energy also. That's dopamine and epinephrine. Yes, we use glucose and glycogen, et cetera, when we're pursuing things. But the idea here is you're pursuing something, and then either by smell or by sight, you think you're on the right track. So you go down that track, and then, there it is. You get some berries, or you get, let's get prehistoric about this, or you get to kill the prey and eat it, and then it gives you energy to continue this pursuit. The key thing here is that, and this is the beauty of the dopamine system, just like the stress system is generic, the fear system is generic, it's designed for a bunch of different scenarios. The motivation system is also generic. It can be to achieve the next lamppost as a milestone, or it can be 5 miles as the next milestone. You get to control that. And so it's completely arbitrary. Right? I mean, one of the most brilliant things that was ever said to me by an extremely skilled psychoanalyst is so simple, and yet I do think it's the most fundamental thing to understanding oneself, is that it's all internal, right? If you finish a marathon in first place, no one comes along and drips dopamine in your ear. You self-generate that. It's all internal. It's all about your internal representation. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't good and bad events in life, but the fact of the matter is that if you set the next milestone as just outside the distance of what you're comfortable with, and you make it there, if you allow yourself a moment to register that win, you get energy to then set the next milestone and achieve it. That energy is dopamine converted into epinephrine, into adrenaline. I sometimes like the analogy that, nowadays you hear about cryptocurrency, or the dollar versus the euro versus the this versus the that. There's only one currency in all of reality, actually, and it's dopamine. Whether or not it's the dollar-backed dopamine, or it's euro-backed dopamine, or Bitcoin-backed dopamine. In the end, whether or not someone has $1 billion or $2 is really that currency resides as something that's transacted in the real world, but their notion of power and potential is dopaminergic. And so too, the potential for mates, the potential for food, how much food you have, how much meat you have stored in the freezer tells you a lot about your security and well-being for you and your family, right? And that is translated into a dopaminergic internal representation of how safe and secure you are, et cetera.